From the heart of Orlando, Florida, the most electrifying show in media, A Neighbor's Choice. I'm your host, David Gornoski, and thank you for joining me once again on our program as we explore the real news. We deal with arts and culture, we deal with science, and we always challenge our tendency. Each one of us tends to falling into groupthink. We always want to challenge ourselves. We always want to think as individuals, but also understanding that there is so much wisdom that we have yet to learn, no matter who we are or what ideologies attract us. And on this program, we don't just deal with politics and culture. We also dive into art. As we've done yesterday, we had on the directors of the new movie Hoaxed, which deals with the way the media manipulates reality in the service of war and perpetual conflict between people. And now I'm joined by someone that's a real treat. He is a good friend of mine that I've met recently via phone, but I've really enjoyed his writings. I'm with the last living member of the Hollywood Blacklist, a former screenwriter and producer for movies like Mission Impossible, Charlie's Angels, Matlock, a lot of great hits that people grew up with, but also some really interesting independent films and documentaries, Mr. Ron Austin. Thank you for joining me, Ron.
Good to be with you, David.
And you and I have a common interest in that we both enjoy the insights of a late French-American who passed away in 2015, René Girard, who was a teacher at Stanford University, and he was a brilliant tour de force of taking various fields of social sciences, anthropology, philosophy, tying them into kind of a theory of everything that put the Bible in the center of human knowledge, but not in a kind of theological way, but in a way of deconstructing the violence that human beings are prone to fall into and what was really the birthplace of our culture with sacrificial scapegoating. And I think that's where we kind of had our connection.
Yes, indeed. A very invaluable figure. I had the great pleasure of meeting him at one time at Stanford, yes. Very significant Christian thinker.
I wanted to dive in with you a couple of things, but I wanted to, talk about your experience on the Hollywood Blacklist in the 1950s. This is a lot of movies and lore and legend and, kind of maybe gets really overhyped in some ways. I think it's pertinent for our times because we live in a day and age where people seem to be really kind of going back into that mindset. I mean, in different ways. When we look at,
I think so.
When we look at the way Hollywood treats people who don't have the same, certain people who have certain faiths, they're not allowed really to have much of a starring role in Hollywood in the industry. But also, there's a lot of people who they would really like to look at the real heart of the Christian archetypes that underpin so much of filmmaking throughout the history, and you were involved with that.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, I think it's a very important subject. I think there's much we can learn from that blacklist period. I believe I am the last living blacklisted writer. Let me give a little background on that, David, and if I go into too much detail, stop me, but I realize that your listeners, this is 70 years ago.
Sure.
So this may sound like some ancient history, but I wrote an article last year that in First Things Journal that I entitled The Myth of the Hollywood Blacklist, and there are actually two myths that I would like to address. But first, just a quick little historical picture. The blacklist came out of the hearings of the House Un-American Activities Committee, 1947 in Hollywood. It was one of the first major media political events. It was on television. And the House committee summoned first a group of writers, Hollywood writers. They were all actually communists. But they defied the committee and refused to answer questions, and some of them went to jail. The myth at that time, David, was that the communist conspiracy was powerful. It was behind all kinds of things. There were reds under every bed, so to speak. The fact of the matter is the Communist Party in America was very weak, very divided. It was trying to have an influence. It just wasn't very, very good at doing it. And these opportunistic politicians created a red scare, it was called, a kind of hysteria. I think there is something like what we're seeing now, some of the sexual allegations that are made, a kind of an atmosphere of hysteria about it. I had become a young communist. I was never a party member. I was a member of the Young Communist League, the youth division, my last year in high school. And by 1956, I had a young family, and graduating college, I had quit the communist movement. I had become disillusioned. I'd only been a young communist for about 5 years or so. I finally broke in as a writer in the late 50s, and that's when the blacklist hit me. The FBI came. They had been aware of me. I had been active in various student organizations, and the FBI came to me in, I think, 58, 59. They were incidentally very polite, two guys in suits, very gently, no bullying, anything like that. But they made it very clear that what they would consider cooperation was strictly giving names. They wanted me to give the name of every person that I knew that had been affiliated with the communist movement. And I couldn't do that because these were young people like myself. Most of them were also disillusioned, but they were going into academia, they were going into sciences, and so I just couldn't do that.
Right.
And I never did. I never gave any names at all. And one of the agents said, the FBI agent said to me, "Well, Ron, what do you think?" And he named the producer I was working for. "What do you think he's going to say when we tell him that you're not cooperating with us?" Well, it was pretty much a direct threat. And I was immediately blacklisted. The scripts I had worked on were never produced, and ultimately they wouldn't even answer, the studio wouldn't even answer my phone calls. So in those days, there were two people in Hollywood behind the scenes that you could contact. If you wanted to be a friendly witness and give names, you could kind of negotiate which names to give.
Right.
But if you were an unfriendly, like I was, there was a big lawyer that had contacts with all the studios, and he could confirm if you were blacklisted or not. And he told my agent, yeah, he's on the list. So I knew I was blacklisted.
Wow.
So for the next 3 or 4 years, I couldn't find employment, and so I had a young family to support. So I became a social worker, county social worker, welfare worker, and I was assigned to the poorest area, the deepest poverty in Los Angeles at that time. And I think in the long run, David, as hard as it was on me at that time, I think it was a blessing. Because for the first time, I had been from a poor family in the Depression, but we just didn't have any money. But for the first time, I encountered real human beings living in contemporary poverty, the drugs and the crime and the broken relationships. And it was a lesson in life I'm not sure I ever would have had if I hadn't have been forced into that situation. And I think that perhaps was the roots of my much later conversion to Christianity, was first becoming aware of what the real human condition was. And it wasn't the Marxist theories or any of those abstract ideas that had to do with people's relations with each other and with God, basically. So in the long run, you could say I was kind of blessed by that incident. The second myth, and this is what I addressed in my article, was the myth that the communists were all just free-thinking liberals. That's simply not true. This glorification of the blacklisted writers as if they were all just free spirits is a myth. These were real communists. They were under control of party discipline. The Communist Party was getting its directions from Moscow. This was not an honest operation. these weren't just free-spirited things, but if you look at some of the movies made about them, it seems like they're just, kind of well-meaning liberals, and that myth needs to be dispelled as well. But I think we can learn a couple of things from the blacklist period, and I'm so pleased you mentioned René Girard, because basically, to put it succinctly, his theory about sacrificial victimhood, or the scapegoat, to put it very simply, it's that we find someone to blame for our problems, a stranger, or a foreigner, or someone we can condemn. And that's what happened kind of first with the communists. We thought all the problems in the world in America were due to some kind of communist conspiracy. But then later, the myth was that all the people that cooperated and exposed communists, the myth was they were all bad people. They were all self-serving or cowardly, and they weren't. Many of them were good people caught in the middle. So there was this myth of the scapegoat, of finding the bad guys to blame. And if we can see how that process works, we start to understand the meaning of Christ's sacrifice, for one thing, and how to, own up to our own responsibilities. And then finally, the second thing is I think we have to see what the role of the media was. And apparently you've been talking to some people about that. The media turned this all into melodrama, and it still does. Basically, mass media tends to create polarization by creating not a drama, but a melodrama of good guys versus bad guys. And boy, the blacklist was a good example of that.
And yet,
that's succinctly my experience.
And yet we see that there's still, like you said, the media is still creating division. So on the other side, I want to dive into this. You're a screenwriter and producer, but I want to ask your opinion about how we can try to redeem mass media, if it's possible at all. You're listening to A Neighbor's Choice. I'm speaking with Ron Austin. I'm David Gornoski. We'll see you in just a moment. And welcome back to A Neighbor's Choice. I'm your host, David Gornoski, and we are examining culture tonight and art, looking at how Christians and people who are concerned for the least of these, which I think all of us are in our own way, but the devil's always in the details of how we act out that concern. And I'm with Ron Austin, a real treasure to have here in the L.A. area. He's a longtime producer and screenwriter in the Hollywood industry. He worked, you even were in a play directed by Mr. Charlie Chaplin, right?
Yes, indeed. That was a theater work. His son was part of our acting company, and so Mr. Chaplin would come and direct our dress rehearsals. That was a great privilege, yes.
Wow. What was it like working with Mr. Chaplin?
Well, he was Charlie Chaplin. I was just a kid actor. No, he was very intense. And he would, when he would be direct, this was a stage production, he would actually get up and stand right next to you. He would kind of take over the performance. But he was a genius. He could get away with that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, very good. So I remember reading some of your writings and some of your essays that you had the privilege of working with a lot of the great Hollywood legends of old Hollywood, in the kind of the golden age era, right? You kind of saw them on their way out of the industry, right?
Yes. The Hollywood that I knew ended by the end of the 60s, and I carried on to television. But in the 60s, I did get a chance to work with Fred Astaire and Gene Kelly, and they're still my heroes.
Yeah.
Real gentlemen, yeah.
Well, very good. So I wanted to kind of touch basis with what you were saying about how to, make art and storytelling. And I see radio as a form of performance art or theater, spoken word. And I think that you're right, that unfortunately so much of the mass media has been kind of easily taken into finger pointing and continually trying to cast out our problems onto the backs of an enemy other that gives us shared meaning whenever we can expel that villain. And that's, of course, what politics is all about. With your work, I think maybe we have a common trajectory somewhat in that you started off as a political ideologue in communism, and then as you started to work with flesh and blood people suffering in dire poverty in East L.A., you had kind of a conversion experience, which led to, your conversion ultimately into Christianity. You saw that ideology was not sufficient in explaining human suffering, human poverty, and the kind of complexity that leads people to have, nagging afflictions and, human frailties, that ideologies just didn't cut it. And I had kind of a similar trajectory a little bit in that I typically kind of was into, typical partisan politics and that kind of thing. And then the more I saw people, flesh and blood people in my community torn apart because of victimless crime laws, where there's no victim on the police report. Yes, they maybe they did a drug or maybe they did this little victimless thing, but there really wasn't a need to cast them into a cage, which is what a prison cell is, in which they're going to receive PTSD and traumatic experiences and be numbered among the transgressors who are actually violent. I found it so abhorrent that I realized that the real root of so much of what the state does and much of what the left and right kind of goes along with is rooted in kind of a vestige of what René Girard had uncovered, that our roots in sacrifice, our need to scapegoat people to kind of cast off our tensions into an easy vessel of wrath. And so once I realized that, none of the ideologies, there was some synergy here and there, but I just realized, man, this is a cultural issue we're dealing with, and that's what's really informing our addiction to all of these laws against nonviolent behaviors, And that's kind of where my program is now, where we have people who call in from prison. We had someone last week, John Bolin, just down the road from our studio here. He's in prison for life because he allowed someone to use his boat to move drugs,
my.
So his son was in there. His son was 8 when he went into prison, and now he's 21. And just it's so absurd and so insane. So how do we kind of use these mediums that we have? You did film. I'm using radio, and I call it documentary radio, where I highlight stories of people afflicted by these bad laws. How do we use these mediums to be more spiritually informed rather than just going along with the fervor of the crowd?
Let me give you a general answer, David. Let me say honestly, I'm not sure. I think we're at one of those points of transition in the period where we've got a lot of surprises ahead and a lot of imagination that's going to have to be used. But let me give you a general answer. I think that we as Christians have basically 3 choices to make. Not only how are we going to use the medium and the arts, but how are we even going to live our lives? And I think we can respect all 3 of them. The first are those good Christians who believe that the social system and the economic system and the prison system and all in the media are still basically sound. They're going to work. They just need to be improved. I would call these reformers. And these are good people. I have good friends like this. They think things are going to be all right if we can just make the machinery work a little better than it is now, make it more just and more rational. The second path, which I think most of the people that I know, most of the Christians I know have been on for some time, I would say these are restorationists. These are people that say, no, reform in itself isn't going to be enough. We're going to have to find a way of restoring the moral, cultural, and religious foundation that this country once had. Mm-hmm. And again, these are good people, and I think we have to respect all of these choices. But the third path, which I call the desert path, is, I think, if I may say so, David, kind of the one that you're taking. You're going out and creating your own radio program. You're not, and if I were a filmmaker, instead of going to Hollywood or thinking that Hollywood is somehow going to be restored to its great glory, I think we've got to hit the desert and find our new ways of creating new forms of relationships, finding communities, what I hear you're doing on your program. this is a desert path. It's not going to be easy, But I think in the long run, this is going to be the realistic way. So I think for filmmakers, for instance, I would not recommend that they go to Hollywood. I think, or even try to be in the marketplace. That's a crapshoot. It always was. I think, though, this is going to be a very interesting time for filmmakers in that it's now possible with the technology to make films very inexpensively if you pooled your resources. I have some of my former students that are doing this. The question will be, what do they do with the films when they're done? Right. And see, you're pioneering a radio audience that you're trying to, and I'm sure you're creating. They're going to have to go out and find a way of creating their own audiences, and I think they're going to have to do that through religious community.
Right.
Now, that sounds very extreme and very radical, that third path, but I think in the long run, that has to be respected as well.
Right. It reminds me of Isaiah, the idea of the remnant, that you're calling out people who see through the matrix of all the lies that the masses have been fed. And I just had on yesterday former NSA tech director William Binney, he built the architecture for the mass surveillance program that I'm glad it wasn't in there when you had your blacklist moment in the Hollywood, because they take every email, everything you've ever said and done, and they use it basically, he says, to intimidate anybody who steps out of line as a dissident to what they want, which is continual Cold War type tactics. And they tried to bury him when he blew the whistle on it. He had created the system originally to just only target terrorists, but they stripped all the protections for Americans and made it a mass collection of every email, every phone call, every text message, everything you've ever said. They harvest it now, no matter who you are in the world. And what was fascinating about it, he was explaining how even the Russian hack, which was supposed to be the basis for this entire Russian invasion of our elections, it's just like a Hollywood scare all over again, the communist scare, the Red Scare, because he said, he's a high-level NSA tech director, now retired, and he said, on my professional opinion, there's no way, based on the transfer speeds, that it was a actual hack online. It was an internal hard drive or a thumb drive that was taking the emails that were released. So from his perspective, the entire premise that the Russians are coming to destroy our democracy, if you look at it from our Girard perspective, it's a classic scapegoating scare, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it certainly sounds like it, indeed, yeah.
So how do we...
I think this technology, and I can only speak from the experience of my students now. Mm-hmm. I'm very low tech. I haven't been involved in actually producing anything for almost 20 years now. I'm 85 years old now, so I'm well retired. But they're using this new technology in a kind of liberating way, at least in their being able to create things with it.
Right.
But how to create, and again, I'm thinking of with the work that you're doing with your program. How to create a community. I was struck by the fact that you were using the word neighborhood. Mm-hmm. I think we've got to be looking to create real, concrete communities now, like some of the lay movements in the church, or the Catholic Church, have been trying to do for years now.
Right.
Real people living in a real place. I don't think technology can ever substitute for that. And a couple of years ago, there was a book called The Benedict Option.
Right. Rod Dreher.
I don't know if you. Right. Yeah. I don't.
Yeah, I write for the American I write for the American Conservative, and he's over there. Yeah, that website.
Yeah. Well, when the book first came out, he caught a lot of flack, and understandably, there's a lot of risks in going in that. You can kind of become separatists or too isolated, or we want to be good neighbors wherever we are. But I think he was onto something in if we can create real community, then it isn't a matter of just preaching words. People can actually look at us Christians, and say, look how they're living. Look how they're treating their husbands and wives. Look how they're raising their kids. I mean, in a way, Christianity has become kind of a silent movie now.
Right.
so people can actually look at real people in real relationships.
Right.
And I think the arts can play a role in that.
And I think, I think focusing on storytelling that looks at the misfit, looks at whether it's a billionaire or a homeless man, we know that scapegoats come in all shapes and sizes. It can be the prom queen who's scapegoated because she's too attractive or whatever, or someone who's a racial minority, or someone who's too old, someone who's too young, someone who has the wrong ideology. There's a lot of people in the conservative movement who are being Chase Bank has been denying them access to use their accounts at Chase Bank because they did political activism that was considered not, appropriate. They've been denied PayPal access, so they can't get any money for their work. They've been blocked off of YouTube and Twitter and Facebook and all these platforms. So there's a real need for Christians to come together, and that's the big question for me, is how do we reach across 70% of Americans say they're Christian, so let's just take half that number. You got close to 40% or so that are really trying to take it seriously. How do we reach at least almost close to half of America that really wants to live up to Jesus's name, right? How do we reach them and say, hey, look, this is what it looks like. We don't have to be in hysteria about special counsels and indicting people and putting everybody in prison and raise the tax and soak the rich, or no, it's all the bums. They're, how do we just kind of break through all this noise as Christians, cut across all this hatred and scapegoating, and give them a message that can connect with people where they're really at, and we got to bring it down to the average person who doesn't have time to get into philosophy or Girard or any of that,
When you use the word remnant, David, and I think so that we don't get discouraged, we don't even really have to reach that many people. I mean, historically, biblically, the remnants sometimes are fairly small.
Right.
So I think even if we, there's a lot of millions of Christians out there, even if we reach just a small portion of them, but it's got to become very real and concrete relationships. That would be my experience, that the media has to become organic in a community. See, in a way, if you go way back to Hollywood, it was originally part of, family movies. People went to the movies on the weekends, and it was a common experience. But in the latter part of the 20th century, it became fragmented. And so there's very few people that see the same movies anymore, And it was, in other words, what I'm saying is the communal experience was lost. Right. I think to some extent we have to regain that. That's the nature of art. I think the discernments that we're making as Christians now, how we're going to live our religious lives, how we're going to live our personal lives, and how we're going to do our work, including the artwork, including films, is all one discernment now. I think they're all one discernment. How are we going to live? And this is very old and very new at the same time. But I think there's an openness. I was just talking with a couple of kids in their 20s. My former students are all in their 30s and 40s and having children now. So I don't see too many kids in their 20s now. But I find they don't have much of a spiritual life or discipline, most of them, but at least they're open.
Right.
That's new. They're open. The door is open. They don't necessarily know how to go through it, but the door is open. So that's a good sign in itself, I think.
We're speaking with screenwriter and producer and the last living member of the Hollywood Blacklist, Mr. Ron Austin. And on the other side, I want to ask you just final thoughts on how people can kind of have courage and stand in solidarity with misfits and those who are left behind by the mass media. I'm David Gornoski. You're listening to A Neighbor's Choice. We'll be back in just a second. And welcome back. Welcome back to A Neighbor's Choice with your host here, David Gornoski, exploring Jesus' personhood revolution, cutting through all the noise and confusion in mainstream media, television, whatever it is. We want to get to a new place, a place where we're not leaving each other negative, leaving each other feeling despondent and anxious, but a place where we can come together, whether you're religious or you're not. We all want to, I think if you polled most people, they'd say, I would like to imitate Jesus in my life. I'd like to learn how he did his thing, and I'd like to understand what he was meaning when he inaugurated a political vision which said the kingdom of God is within you all, in a plural sense. And I'm here with Ron Austin, a screenwriter, producer for many great hits in television and film, and we're having kind of a reflection together. I am working in the radio medium. He worked in film, and trying to understand how we can build a community in this noise and confusion that honors the personhood, doesn't go into communism or other ideologies where you're sacrificing people for the greater good. As Caiaphas said when he killed Jesus, it's better that one man die than the whole nation perish. We want to remove that as the linchpin behind our community making. And how can we do that? So, Ron, just kind of pick up where we left off. How do we try to cut through all this noise and lead by example in a way where we can still deal with these unjust, laws that criminalize nonviolent people for everything that unimaginable, and then all these wars that are always continuing that, it seems like there's a bipartisan consensus. How do we find those remnants? How do we speak to them? In your writings on film, you talk about how spiritual truth often is found in silence. What do you mean by that? And does that have any insight for what I'm looking for here?
Well, the tradition of finding an openness and a silence as a way of overcoming the ego self so that we can hear the voice of God is in all of the great traditions, but I think it's the very heart of a Christian vision. But let me answer your question as far as the direction in a very personal way, very personal to me right now. The answer, I couldn't do better than what you've been saying, David. The answer is Jesus. He is the Alpha and the Omega. He's at the very heart of what we need to follow. And I don't need to say that more because you've already said that. But for me personally, I'm a Roman Catholic. And for me, the other great guide is Mother Mary. Mm-hmm. And I don't think you have to necessarily be a traditional Roman Catholic like I am to see the great value of the spiritual women of our time. There's such a big emphasis now between these gender conflicts and whether women are being treated equally. And I understand that. I raised 2 daughters, and I want them treated justly. But I think we're missing the boat when we don't see the very special, unique feminine spirituality that is available to us. And my Lenten reading this year will be almost all women, contemporary women, including wonderful American writers like Flannery O'Connor and Dorothy Day, the founder of Catholic Workers. I could go on. I could name a dozen women that all lived within my lifetime. And I think that feminine spirituality, which is represented by our Mother Mary, it should be available to everyone. I mean, if we read with fair and open hearts, that's a very special gift, and I'm feeling that more and more. I lost my wife of over 40 years some years ago, but it was her love. She was a Jewish woman. It was her love that pointed me towards Christ in my conversion, that very unique love of a devoted mother and wife. And I think that's a resource that we really need to tap on now, is that feminine vision and feminine spirituality.
It's very interesting. I have a little theory myself that so much of why we have these gender wars is because we have kind of taken a cut, chop, stab approach to our politics. You know, we if we don't like something, tax it. That means take something from it. Regulate it. That means use coercion. Dominate it. Or if we don't like it, we subsidize it, which means we're going to take from somebody else and give it to another person. There's always this kind of brute force behind our politics.
Mm-hmm. And and that's male.
Right.
That's very male, and it's interesting that there are women that say we want to have as much power as you guys do. They don't need the power; they have grace.
Wow,
that's a greater power than male power. That full of grace. That's a special gift that women are given, I believe. They shouldn't be competing with us.
We're speaking with Ron Austin, and we're going to have one more segment here where I just want to, you went through a very interesting experience with the Hollywood Blacklist and a wonderful career in Hollywood. And just final thoughts on this last segment coming up. You're listening to A Neighbor's Choice with David Gornoski. We'll be right back. In a fight for the soul of human civilization, one neighbor at a time, you're listening to A Neighbor's Choice. I'm David Gornoski. I'm joined by Ron Austin, a man who I think has a little bit of insight for us as we go through this scapegoating crazy time where we're pinpointing, we're looking for war with Russia, sanctioning Venezuela, overthrow Russia, constant war, constant needs for special counsels and investigations. It's a really frenetic time. It's a time that I think really has a lot of need for Christians to be the adults in the room, to step up and to use their platforms, whether it's just in their own personal lives or if they have the opportunity to be a part of art or media, and even social media now. You can get a reach just in your own social media to bear witness to the truth that sacrifice is finished with Jesus and that there's no need to scapegoat our neighbors to solve our problems. It won't solve our problems. It'll only leave us more bitter and unsatisfied.
Amen.
I think there's a reason why that song, Can't Get No Satisfaction, was rated as one of the number one songs by Rolling Stone for the last century.
Yes, spot on. Spot on, yeah. Well, look, David, I'm not an original thinker. I'm just an old Hollywood guy, and my experiences were validated by some very astute people that saw how scapegoating was taking place. And we've got, since some of these really prophetic voices wrote, we've had 30 years to see the results, and I think it was clear that their vision was one we should have been listened to. The first you mentioned was René Girard. And for those people who tend to be scholarly, because he's not an easy read, René Girard really is a basic thinker of our time, and you've articulated some of that very well. My old friend Gil Bailey wrote a book some years ago called Violence Unveiled, which is a good layman's introduction to Girard's theories. But there were also some guys writing in the 70s and 80s that I would like to recommend to your listeners.
Sure.
And you can see in the years that have passed how right they were. For instance, Neil Postman wrote a book called Amusing Ourselves to Death.
Okay, yeah.
And Christopher Lasch wrote a book called Culture of Narcissism.
Mm-hmm.
And the wonderful novelist Walker Percy wrote Lost in the Cosmos, the last self-help book, which is not only wise but hilarious. And Percy said we have entered, this would have been the 80s now, he says we've entered the no-name new age because nobody quite knows where we're going now. So I would recommend that people to go back and look at these prophetic voices and see how the experiences of the last generation have validated this. And I think we can learn from them.
So in our efforts to build community and imitation of Christ, I call what the gospel gives us a form of technology in that it's a weird kind of cultural shifting technology. You find victims who have been violently ostracized from society, whether it's someone who violated some regulation or someone who was sanctioned in another country and they're starving, their family's poor now, or whether it's someone down the road whose whole family is torn apart for some petty vice. And just tell their story. Tell it honestly, because that's what the gospel writers did for Jesus. They just took the medium of their time. They didn't have radio. They didn't have cinema. They wrote these stories, and they said, this is what happened to Jesus. This is what he said. This is what the crowd was motivated by. Envy, petty resentment, stirred up by passions. One week they loved him. The next week they want to kill him, just like Julius Caesar in Shakespeare's play. You know, it just told the truth of the wrongful persecution of an innocent, nonviolent person. And I think that has its own technological power in and of itself, don't you?
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. And I think I would urge people that are storytellers, whether it's film or poetry or whatever, avoid propaganda. Write truthfully out of your own experience, out of your own. We have a tendency in the religious world to sometimes use some of the advertising techniques around us. You know, it's much more powerful if you can relate this to your direct personal experience. And David, when it comes to scapegoating, we've got to face the reality that we could be the next generation of scapegoats ourselves.
Right.
This has happened. If the way things are going now with all of the fear and hatred and division, those of us who stand up and speak the truth of Christ, we have to be prepared. We may be the next. We may be scapegoats ourselves.
Take up your cross and follow him, right?
That's it. And what joy and peace that brings.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ron Austin. RonAustinScribblings.com is his website. Thank you again for joining us. You've listened to another episode of A Neighbor's Choice. We'll join you on Thursday night, 8 o'clock Eastern Time. We'll see you there on News Radio 93.1 WFLA. Godspeed.
Hi, this is David Gornoski, founder of A Neighbor's Choice. A Neighbor's Choice is sponsored by people just like you, making weekly or monthly contributions to support the development of this show, which is dedicated to introducing Jesus' personhood revolution to the broader public. Visit www.aneighborschoice.com, click on Contribute, and start your monthly pledge today.